All right, this is going to be a long one. However, I won't be doing notes at the end of this one. Instead, I'm going to preface this one. First of all, we just went over Cain, the children of Cain, and the giants, like the sons of the sons of God, and their how they seduced men and women, apparently, and taught them the arts of seduction. But today we're doing Noah and the tribes that's the flood, and the tribes that flowed out from the flood, and it's extensive, and it's like a math book. Whereas if you miss or misunderstand something, you're going to get lost in the middle. So instead, I'm going to take a lot of time to clearly illustrate on the screen what happened in the text, so that people can follow along a little bit better. Because we get introduced to a lot of these characters and we don't really know who they are, because when you're introduced to a character, you want them to be known by something they do, but it's just she gives us the character and then tells us what they do afterwards, but we don't really get a proper introduction, so we can't sort of web the knowledge. And she saw all these things, but we just have to take her word for it. So instead, what I'm going to do is try to help us web the knowledge a lot better. And when I say webbing, I mean get to know characters through more than one means. And this is how you learn things, through more than one means. You learn more than one thing about it. Like, for example, when you're memorizing a prayer, you learn the lines that come before and after it. You learn the first letters of every line. You learn the rhythm in which they speak, that's webbing. Learning all the little facts about the prayers is webbing, and it helps you learn those things truly. So on the screen, I'm going to give visual aids for this particular reading. Now I'll get into the reading. Subtext: Noah and his posterity, Ham and Djemschid, the leaders of the people. I saw Noah, a simple-hearted old man, clothed in a long white garment. He was walking about in an orchard and pruning the trees with a crooked bone knife. A cloud hovered over him, and in it was a human figure. Noah fell on his knees. I saw that he was then and there interiorly instructed upon God's design to destroy humankind, and he was commanded to build an ark. I saw that Noah grew sad at the announcement, that he prayed for the punishment to be averted. He did not begin the work at once. Again, the Lord appeared to him twice in succession, commanding him to begin the building, otherwise he should perish with the rest of humankind. At last, I saw Noah removing, with all of his family, to the country in which Zoroaster, the shining star, subsequently dwelt. Noah settled in a high, woody, solitary region where he and his numerous followers lived under tents. Here he raised an altar and offered sacrifice to the Lord. Neither Noah nor any of his family built permanent houses, because they put faith in the prophecy of the deluge. But the godless nations around laid massive foundations, marked off courts, and erected all kinds of buildings designed to resist the inroads of time and the attacks of the enemy. There were frightful deeds upon the earth in those days. Men delivered themselves up to all kinds of wickedness, even the most unnatural. They plundered one another and carried off whatever suited them best. They laid waste homes and fields. They kidnapped women and maidens. In proportion to their increase in numbers was the wickedness of Noah's posterity. They even robbed and insulted Noah himself. They had not fallen into the state of base degradation from want of civilization. They were not wild and barbarous. Rather, they lived commodiously and had well-ordered households. But they were deeply imbued with wickedness. They practiced the most shameful idolatry, everyone making his own god of whatever pleased him best. By diabolical arts, they sought to seduce Noah's immediate family. Moloch, the son of Japhet and grandson of Noah, was thus corrupted after he had, while working in the field, taken from them a poisonous beverage which intoxicated him. It was not wine, but the juice of a plant which they were accustomed to drink in small quantities during their work, and whose leaves and fruits they chewed. Moloch became the father of a son who was named Ham. When the child was born, Moloch begged his brother Tubal to take it and thus hide his guilt. Tubal did so out of fraternal affection. The child, with the stalks and sprout of a certain vicious root, was laid by his mother before Tubal's tent. She hoped thereby to acquire a right over his inheritance, but the deluge was already at hand, and so her plans were fruitless. Tubal took the boy and had him reared in his family without betraying his origin. And so it happened in this way that the child was taken into the ark. Tubal called the boy Ham, the name of the root whose sprouts lay near him as the only sign. The child was not nourished with milk, but with the same root. If that plant is allowed to grow up straight, it will reach the height of a man. But when it creeps along the ground, it sends up shoots like the asparagus, hard with tender tops. It is used as food and as a substitute for milk. The root is bulbous, and from it rises a crown of a few brown leaves. Its stem is tolerably quick, and the pith is used as meal, cooked like pap, or spread in thin layers and baked. Wherever it thrives, it grows luxuriantly and covers leagues of grounds. I saw it in the ark. It was long before the ark was completed, for Noah often discontinued it for years at a time. 3 times did God warn him to proceed with it. Each time Noah would engage workmen, recommence, and again discontinue in the hope that God would relent. But at last, the work was finished. I saw that in the ark, as in the cross, there were 4 kinds of wood: palm, olive, cedar, and cypress. I saw the wood felled and hewed upon the spot, and Noah bearing it himself upon his shoulders to the place of building, just as Jesus afterward carried the wood of his cross. The spot chosen for the construction of the ark was a hill surrounded by a valley. First the bottom was put in. The ark was rounded in the back, and the keel, shaped like a trough, was smeared with pitch. It had 2 stories supported on hollow posts, which stood one above the other. These posts were not round trunks of trees, they were in oval sections filled with a white pith which became fibrous toward the center. The trunk was knotty or furrowed, and the great leaves grew around it without branches, probably a species of palm. I saw the workmen punching the pith out with a tool. All other trees were cut into thin planks. When Noah had carried all the materials to the appointed spot and arranged them in order, the building was begun. The bottom was put in and pitched, the first row of posts raised, the holes in which they stood filled up with pitch. Then came the second floor, with another row of posts for the third floor. and then the roof. The spaces between the posts were filled in with brown and yellow laths placed crosswise, the holes and chinks being stuffed with a kind of wool found on certain trees and plants, and a white moss that grows very abundantly around some trees. Then all was pitched inside and outside. The roof was rounded. The entrance between the two windows was in the center of one side, a little more than halfway up. In the middle of the roof, likewise, was a square opening. When the ark had been entirely covered with pitch, it shone like a mirror in the sun. Noah went on working alone, and for a long time, at the different compartments for the animals, as all were to be separate. 2 passages extended through the middle of the ark, and back in the oval part, concealed by hangings, stood a wooden altar, the table of which was semicircular. A little in front of the altar was a pan of coals. This was their fire. Right and left were spaces partitioned off for sleeping apartments. All kinds of chests and utensils were carried into the ark, and numerous seeds, plants, and shrubs were put into the earth around the walls, which were soon covered with verdure. I saw something like vines carried in, and on them large yellow grapes, the bunches as long as one's arm. No words can express what Noah endured from the malice and the ill will of the workmen during the whole time that the ark was building. They mocked him. They insulted him in every way. They called him a fool. He paid them well in cattle, but that did not prevent their reviling him. No one knew why he was building the ark, therefore did they ridicule him. When all was finished, I saw Noah giving thanks to God, who then appeared to him. He told him to take a reed pipe and call all the animals from the 4 corners of the globe. The nearer the day of chastisement approached, the darker grew the heavens. Frightful anxiety took possession of the whole earth. The sun no longer showed its face, and the roar of the thunder was increasingly heard. I saw Noah going a short distance, north, south, east, and west, blowing upon his reed pipe. The animals came flocking at the sound and entered the ark in order, 2 by 2, male and female. They went in by a plank laid from the entrance to the ground. When all were safe inside, the plank was also hoisted in. The largest animals, white elephants and camels, went in first. They were restless as at the approach of a storm, and it took several days for all of them to enter. The birds flew in through the skylight and perched under the roof on poles and in cages, while the waterfowl went into the bottom of the vessel. The land animals were in the middle story. Of such as are slaughtered, there were 7 couples. The ark lying there by itself at the top of the hill shone with a bluish light. At a distance it looked as if it were descending from the clouds. Now the time for the deluge drew nigh. Noah had already announced it to his family. He took with him into the ark Shem, Ham, and Japhet with their wives and their children. There were in the ark grandsons with from 50 to 80 years old, with their children small and large. All that had labored at its construction and who were good and free from idolatry entered with Noah. There were over 100 people in the ark, and they were necessary to give daily food to the animals and to clean after them. I must say, for I always see it so, that Shem's, Ham's, and Japhet's children all went into the ark. There were many little boys and girls in it. In fact, all of Noah's family that were good. Holy Scripture mentions only 3 of Adam's children, Cain, Abel, and Seth, And yet I see many others among them, and I always see them in pairs, boys and girls. And so too in 1 Peter 3, chapter 3, verse 20, only 8 souls are mentioned as saved in the ark, that is, the 4 ancestral couples by whom, after the deluge, the earth was to be peopled. I also saw Ham in the ark. The child was fastened by his skin into a bark cradle formed like a trough. I saw many infants cradled in a similar way, floating on the waters of the deluge. When the ark rose on the waters, the crowds of people upon surrounding mountains and in the high trees were weeping and lamenting. When the waters were covered with the floating bodies of the drowned and with uprooted trees, Noah and his family were already safe inside. Before he and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives entered the ark, he once more implored God's mercy. When all had entered, Noah drew in the plank and made fast the door. He left outside near relatives and their families who, during the building of the ark, had separated from him. Then burst forth a fearful tempest. The lightnings played in fiery columns. The rains fell in torrents. The hill upon which the ark stood soon became an island. The misery was great, so great, I trust, it was the means of many a soul's salvation. I saw a devil, black and hideous, with pointed jaws and a long tail, going to and fro through the tempest and tempting men to despair. Toads and serpents sought a hiding place in the crevices of the ark. Flies and vermin I saw not. They came into existence later to torment men. I saw Noah offering sacrifice in the ark upon an altar covered with red, over which was a white cloth. In an arched chest was preserved the bones of Adam. During prayer and sacrifice, Noah laid them on the altar. I saw on the altar likewise the chalice of the Last Supper, which, during the building of the ark, had been brought to Noah by 3 figures in long white garments. They looked like the 3 men that announced to Abraham the birth of a son. They came from a city that was destroyed at the time of the deluge. They addressed Noah as one whose fame had reached them, and told him that he should take with him into the ark a mysterious something that they gave him in order that it might escape the waters of the deluge. That mysterious thing was that chalice. In it lay a grain of wheat, large as a sunflower seed, and a vine branch. Noah stuck both into a yellow apple and put it into the chalice. The chalice had no cover, for the branch was to grow out of it. After the dispersion of men at the building of the Tower of Babel, I saw that chalice in the possession of one of Shem's descendants in the country of Semiramis. He was the ancestor of the Semenazes. Let me try that again. Semenenses, who were established at Canaan by Melchizedek. Hither they took the chalice. I saw the ark driving over the waters and dead bodies floating around. It rested upon a high rocky peak of a mountain chain far to the east of Syria. And there it remained for a long time. I saw that land was already appearing. It looked like mud covered with a greenish mold. Immediately after the deluge, fish and shellfish began to be eaten. Afterwards, as the people multiplied, they ate bread and birds. They planted gardens, and the soil was so fruitful that the wheat which they sowed produced ears as large as those of maize. The root from which Ham received his name was also planted. Noah's tent stood on the spot where, at a later period, was that of Abraham. In the plain and in the surrounding country, Noah's sons had their tents. I saw the cursing of Ham, but Shem and Japhet received from Noah on their knees the blessing. It was delivered to them with ceremonies similar to those used by Abraham when giving over the same blessing to Isaac. I saw the curse pronounced by Noah upon Ham, moving toward the latter like a black cloud and obscuring him. His skin lost its whiteness. He grew darker. His sin was the sin of sacrilege, the sin of one who would forcibly enter the ark of the covenant. I saw a most corrupt race descend from Ham and sink deeper and deeper into darkness. I see that the dark, idolatrous nations are the descendants of Ham. It wouldn't be impossible for me to say how I beheld the nations increasing and extending and, in many different ways, falling into darkness and corruption. But with all of that, many luminous rays streamed forth from them and sought the light. When Tubal, the son of Japhet, and his own children, and those of his brother Mozak, sought counsel of Noah as to the country to which they should migrate, there were 15 families in number. Noah's children already extended far around, and the families of Tubal and Mozak also dwelt at some distance from Noah. But when Noah's children began to quarrel and oppress one another, Tubal decided to remove still farther off. He wanted to have nothing to do with Ham's descendants, who were already thinking of building the tower. He and his family heeded not the invitation received later to engage in that undertaking, and it was declined also by the children of Shem. Tubal with his troop of followers appeared before Noah's tent, asking for directions as to whither he should go. Noah dwelt upon a mountain range between Libanus and Caucasus. He wept when he saw Tubal and his followers, for he loved that race because it was better, more God-fearing than the others. He pointed out a region toward the northeast, charged them to be faithful to the commands of God and to the offering of sacrifice, and made them promise to guard the purity of their descent, and not to intermingle with the descendants of Ham. He gave them girdles and breastpieces that he had in the ark. The heads of the family were to wear them when engaged in divine service and performing marriage ceremonies, in order to guard against malediction and a depraved posterity. The ceremonies used by Noah when offering sacrifice reminded me of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. There were alternate prayers and responses, and Noah moved from place to place at the altar and bowed reverently. He gave them likewise a leather bag containing a vessel made of bark, in which was an oval golden box, enclosing 3 other smaller vessels. They also received from him the root or bulbs of that palm plant, rolls of bark or skins upon which were written characters, and round wooden blocks upon which signs were engraved. These people were of a bright reddish-yellow complexion and very beautiful. They were clothed in skins and woolen garments, girdled at the waist, the arms alone bare. The skins they were scarcely drawn from the animal when they were clapped, still bloody, on the limbs. They fitted so tightly that my first thought was, those people are hairy. Not so. However, for their own skin was smooth as satin, With the exception of various kinds of seed, they did not take much baggage with them, since they were departing for a high region toward the northeast. I saw no camels, but they had horses, asses, and animals with spreading horns like stags. I saw them, Tubal's followers, on a high mountain where they dwelt one above another in long, low huts like arbors. I saw them digging the ground, planting and setting out trees in rows. The opposite side of the mountain was cold. Later on, the whole region became much colder. In consequence of this change in the climate, one of the grandsons of Tubal, the ancestor Djemschid, led them further toward the southwest. With a few exceptions, all who had seen Noah and had taken leave of him died in this place, that is, on the mountain to which Tubal had led them. They who followed Djemschid were all born on the same mountain. They took with them the few surviving old men who had known Noah, carrying them very carefully in litters. And Tubal with his family separated from Noah. I saw among them that the child of Mozak, Ham, who had gone with Tubal into the ark. Ham was already grown, and later on I saw him very different from those around him. He was of large stature like a giant, and of a very serious, peculiar turn of mind. He wore a long robe, and he was like a priest. He used to go alone to the summit of the mountain, and there spend night after night. He observed the stars and practiced magic. He was taught by the devil to arrange what he saw in vision into a science, a religion, and thereby he vitiated and counteracted the teaching of Enoch. The evil inclinations inherited from his mother mingled in with him with the pure hereditary teachings of Enoch and Noah, to which the children of Tubal clung. Ham, by his false visions and revelations, misinterpreted and changed the ancient truth. He studied and pondered, watched the stars, and had visions which, by Satan's agency, showed him deformed images of truth. Through their resemblance to truth, his doctrine and idolatry became the mothers of heresy. Tubal was a good man. Ham's manners of acting and his teachings were very displeasing to Tubal, who was greatly grieved to see one of his sons, the father of Djemschid, attach himself to Ham. I heard Tubal complaining, "My children are not united. Would that I had not separated from Noah." Ham conducted the waters of two springs, from the higher part of the mountain down to the dwellings. They soon united into one stream, which after a short course swelled into a broad torrent. I saw Djemschid and his followers crossing it at their departure. Ham received almost divine homage from his followers. He taught them that God exists in fire. He had also much to do with water and with that vicious root from which he derived his name. He planted it and solemnly distributed it as a sacred medicine and nourishment. This distribution at last became a ceremony of religion. He carried its juice, or pap, around with him in a brown vessel like a mortar. The axes were of the same material. They got them from people of another tribe that lived far away in a mountainous country and forged such implements by means of fire. I saw them on a mountain from which fire bursts forth, sometimes in one place, sometimes in another. I think the vessel which Ham carried around with him was made out of the melted metal or rock that flowed from the mountain, which was caught in a mold. Ham never married, nor did he live to be very old. He published many of his visions referring to his own death. He himself put faith in them, as did also Darketo and his other followers at a later period. But I saw him dying a frightful death. and the evil one carried off body and soul. Nothing remained of him. For that reason, his followers thought that, like Enoch, he had been taken up to a holy dwelling place. The father of Djemschid had been a pupil of Ham, and Ham left him his spirit in order that he might then be the one who would succeed him. On account of this knowledge, Djemschid became the leader of his people. They soon became a nation and were led by Djemschid still further south. Djemschid was very distinguished. He was well educated and had embraced Ham's teaching. He was unspeakably lively and vigorous, much more active and better also than Ham, who was of a dark, rigid disposition. He practiced the religion formulated by Ham, added many things of his own thereto, and gave much attention to the stars. His followers regarded fire as sacred. They were all distinguished by a certain sign which denoted their race. People at that time kept together in tribes. They did not intermingle then as now. Djemschid's special aim was to improve the races and maintain them in their original purity. He separated and transplanted them as seemed best to him. He left them perfectly free, and yet they were very submissive to him. The descendants of those races, whom I now see wild and barbarous in distant land and islands, are not to be compared with their progenitors in point of personal beauty or manly character. For these early nations were noble and simple, yet withal most valiant. The races of the present day are also far less skillful and clever, and possess less bodily strength. On his marches, Djemschid laid the foundations of tent cities, marked off fields, made long roads of stone, and formed settlements here and there of certain numbers of men and women, to whom he gave animals, trees, and plants. He rode around large tracts of land, striking into the earth with an instrument, which he always carried in his hand, and his people then set to work in those places, grubbing and hacking, making hedges and digging ditches. Djemschid was remarkably strict and just. I saw him, and just, that is, like just as in judgment. I saw him as a tall old man, very thin and of a yellowish red complexion. He rode a surprisingly nimble little animal with slender legs and black and yellow stripes, very much like an ass. Djemschid rode around a tract of land just as poor people go around a field on a heath by night, and thus appropriated it for cultivation. He paused here and there, plunged his grubbing axe into the ground, and drove in a stake to mark the sites of future settlements. The instrument, which was afterward called Djemschid's golden plowshare, was in form like a Latin cross. It was about the length of one's arm when drawn out, formed with the shaft of a right angle. With this instrument, Djemschid made fissures in the earth. A representation of the same appeared on the side of his robes, where pockets generally are. Reminded me of the symbol of office that Joseph and Asenath also carried in Egypt, and with which they also surveyed the land, though that of Djemschid was more like a cross. On the upper part was a ring into which it could be run. Djemschid wore a mantle that fell backwards from the front. From his girdle to the knee hung 4 leathern flaps, 2 behind and 2 before, strapped at the side and fastened under the knee. His feet were bound with leather and straps. He wore a golden shield on his breast. He had several similar breastplates to suit various solemnities. His crown was a pointed circlet of gold. The point in front was higher and bent like a little horn, and on the end of it waved something like a little flag. Djemschid constantly spoke of Enoch. He knew that he had taken away from the earth without undergoing death. He taught that Enoch had delivered over to Noah all goodness and all truth, had appointed him the father and guardian of all blessings, and that from Noah all these blessings had passed over to himself. He wore about him a golden egg-shaped vessel in which, as he said, was contained something precious that had been preserved by Noah in the ark, and which had been handed down to himself. Wherever he pitched his tent, there the golden vessel was placed in a column, and over it on elegant posts marked with all kinds of figures, a covering was stretched. It looked like a little temple. The cover of the vessel was a crown of filigree work. When Djemschid lighted fire, he threw into it something that he took out of the vessel. The vessel had indeed been used in the ark, for Noah had preserved the fire in it. But it was now the treasured idol of Djemschid and his people. When it was set up, fire burned before it, to which prayers were offered and animals sacrificed. For Djemschid taught that the great God dwells in light and fire, and that he has many inferior gods and spirits serving him. All submitted to Djemschid. He established colonies of men and women here and there, gave them herds, and permitted them to plant and build. They were now allowed to follow their own pleasure in the matter of marriage, for Djemschid treated them like cattle, assigning wives to his followers in accordance with his own views. He himself had several. One was very beautiful and of a better family than the others. Djemschid destined his son by her to be his successor. By his orders, great round towers were built, which were ascended by steps for the purpose of observing the stars. The women lived apart and in subjection. They wore garments, short garments, the bodice and breast of material like leather, and some kind of stuff hung behind. Around the neck and over the shoulders, they wore a full circular cloak, which fell below the knee. On the shoulders and breast, it was ornamented with signs or letters from every country that he settled. Djemschid caused straight roads to be made in the direction of Babel. Djemschid always led his people to uninhabited regions, where there were no nations to expel. He marched everywhere with perfect freedom, for he was only a founder, a settler. His race was of a bright reddish-yellow complexion like ochre, very handsome people. All were marked in order to distinguish the pure from those of mixed descent. Djemschid marched over a high mountain covered with ice. I do not remember how he succeeded in crossing, but many of his followers perished. They had horses or asses. Djemschid rode on a little striped animal. A change of climate had driven them from their country. It became too cold for them, but it is warmer there now. Occasionally he met on his march a helpless tribe, either escaping from the tyranny of their chief or awaiting in distress the advent of some leader. They willingly submitted to Djemschid, for he was gentle and he brought them grain and blessings. They were destitute exiles who, like Job, had been plundered and banished. I saw some poor people who had no fire and who were obliged to bake their bread on hot stones in the sun. When Djemschid gave them fire, they looked upon him as a god. He fell in with another tribe that sacrificed children who were deformed or who did not reach their standard of beauty. The little ones were buried up to the waist and a fire kindled around them. Djemschid abolished this custom. He delivered many poor children, whom he placed in a tent and confided to the care of some women. He afterward made use of them here and there as servants. He was very careful to keep the genealogical line pure. Djemschid first marched into a southwesterly direction, keeping the Prophet Mountain to the south on his left. Then he turned to the south, the mountains still on his left, but to the east. I think he afterward crossed the Caucasus. At that period, when those regions were swarming with human beings, when all life and activity, our countries were but forests and wilderness and marshes, only off toward the east might be met a small wandering tribe. The shining star, Zoroaster, who lived long after, was descended from Djemschid's son, whose teachings he revived. Djemschid wrote all kinds of laws on bark and tables of stone. One long letter often stood for a whole sentence. Their language was as yet the primitive one, to which ours still bears some resemblance. Djemschid lived just prior to Durkato and her daughter, the mother of Semiramis. He did not go to Babel himself, though his career ran in that direction. I saw the history of Ham and Djemschid as Jesus spoke of it before the pagan philosophers at Lanifa in the Isle of Cyprus. These philosophers had in Jesus' presence spoken of Djemschid as the most ancient of the wise kings who had come from far beyond India. With a golden dagger received from God, he had divided off and peopled many lands, and had scattered blessings everywhere. They questioned Jesus about him and the various wonders related to him, and Jesus responded to their questions by saying that Djemschid was by nature a prudent man, a man wise according to flesh and blood, that he had been the leader of the nations, that upon the dispersion of men at the building of the Tower of Babel, he had led one race and settled countries according to a certain order. That there had been other leaders of that kind who had indeed led a worse life than he, because his race had not fallen into so great ignorance as many others. But Jesus showed him also that what fables had been written about him, and that he was a false side picture, a counterfeit type of the priest and king Melchizedek. He told them to notice the difference between Djemschid's race and that of Abraham. As the stream of nations moved along, God had sent Melchizedek to the best families to lead and unite them, to prepare for them lands and abiding places, in order that they might preserve themselves unsullied, and in proportion to their degree of worthiness, be found more or less fit to receive the grace of the promise. Who Melchizedek was, Jesus left to themselves to determine, but of one thing they might be certain: he was an ancient type of the future, but then fast approaching fulfillment of the promise. The sacrifice of bread and wine which he had offered would be fulfilled and perfected, and would continue till the end of time. End of reading.